Well, ladies and gentlemen, just before the awards, it's my enormous pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Elizabeth Broderick, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Elizabeth had a distinguished career in corporate law, and now she's got, in a sense, new and ever-challenging work to overcome discrimination against women, including violence against women. And she's active on several boards, the Vic Health Advisory Board, the World Bank's Advisory Council on Gender and Development, and of course she's leading a review into the treatment of women in the Australian Defence Forces. She's been in Afghanistan, I think quite recently, and also under the sea in a submarine for a quite extended period of time as part of that work. I'd just like to mention something that I mentioned when I did a feature article myself on Elizabeth's work, which is she took June Oscar and Emily Carter from Fitzroy Crossing in the Kimberley to the United Nations to talk about the work they were doing in their community to reduce violence and rebuild that community, work that reduced violence, eliminated 45% of the violence in that community. So please welcome a very practical person, Elizabeth Broderick.
Thanks very much, Julie, for that very generous introduction, and it's just such a great pleasure to be here. I know so many familiar faces because I know when I first came into the role in 2007, I thought, right, violence against women, that was one area I knew I absolutely needed to focus on. Who were the experts in Australia? So I came straight to Victoria, and I came for a number of reasons. I came because I heard so much that was good about the integrated responses that are here, that there was a government that was prepared to share power with NGOs, that the courts, the police, media, the CWA, other organisations were all coming together with a strong collective intent to do something about this issue. So, you know, a lot of what I've learnt about violence against women in Australia comes from the great advice and expertise I've had from members of the Victorian community. So thank you very, very much. I too want to acknowledge that we're meeting here on traditional lands and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to thank all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, men and women who tirelessly work to eliminate violence against women. I mean, one of the great things about my job is I travel extensively and I meet so many strong advocates in this area. As I said, I came in 2007, and at that time my son was about 13 years old. I raced home one day, I said, guess what, Tom? Mum's going to be Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. Oh, Mum, that is so gross, he said. Well, I'm happy to tell you it's not gross. As I said to Julie before, I mean, what other job can you go from 200 metres below the ocean floor to, you know, a Black Hawk helicopter in Oregon province to the World Bank to the United Nations to camping out with Aboriginal women in Australia? There's not many jobs that take you to that place. So it's just such a privilege to be in this role. And to really, I've been fortunate to have my term extended by 2 years, and I know absolutely that violence against women will be my main priority over that time. So I was just so excited when I got the invitation to present at the EVAs, and that was about 6 or 8 months ago. You were also very organised, and I've really been looking forward to this night. Because people often say to me, they say, well, what's the media doing to, refute some of the harmful images about women and the stereotypes that exist in society? And, now I'm absolutely there saying, well, there's a whole range of things, but for a start, there's the EVAs. And it's initiatives like the EVAs, the celebration of responsible reporting of excellence in journalism around this area that can and is making a difference. Because as we all know, violence against women is one of the most pervasive human rights abuses that is happening in this country today. It's reached epidemic proportions. I mean, it was to hear from Ken and others just about how many calls there are every single night around this particular issue. And, you all know the stats much better than I, but to think that more than one woman a week is murdered by an intimate partner here in Australia, that is just so very sobering and really horrifying. And it is important to have the statistics, absolutely. It's necessary to identify the prevalence, because if we don't have that strong prevalence data and data from the courts and the coroner and all the other places, then we don't know whether we're getting better at this or worse. But my point tonight is that the statistics really only tell one part of a story. And when you view the statistics in isolation or repeated as they often are, without the necessary context, then they actually hide the human face, the human cost of that violence. And I think that's another reason why the EVAs are so important, because the EVAs recognise the critical role that journalists play in telling the stories. It's the stories that galvanise the community. It's the stories that compel policymakers to take action. It's the stories that encourage individuals, advocates, community and business leaders, politicians, union representatives, human rights activists to open their hearts and minds to the devastating impact that violence has on women's lives. And not only that, but to the incredible strength and resilience exhibited by so many women who live day in, day out with violence. And it's also the reason why, as I travel extensively, not just in Australia but internationally, I like to tell the stories, the good stories and also the not so good. It's women like Catherine Smith, a truly courageous woman from rural New South Wales. Now, Catherine, as some of you here tonight may already know, she went to extraordinary lengths to protect herself and her children from years and years of family violence. And she was able to accompany me into the United Nations just 2 months ago when we went on the Commission on the Status of Women, and Fiona was there as well, which was terrific. And she went to tell her story about being a woman in a rural community and the particular impacts for women in rural communities who were living in violent relationships. And I think it was just so important because the fact is, it's one thing for the data to tell us that there are insufficient refuges in regional and rural communities across Australia. It's another to hear from Catherine about how she would run at night with 4 children, 2 in their school uniform. She'd walk almost 80 kilometres to the nearest violent shelter, sleeping on the riverbank with only the clothes that the family had on their backs. And the stories of the children growing up in violent households. I mean, her daughter Vicky came into the United Nations with me as well on the same trip, and she told the UN when she addressed them earlier this year, she said, "My earliest childhood memory of the terrorism in our home was when I was in bed for the night and Dad was yelling at Mum in the kitchen. I heard the cutlery drawer opening and my heart sank. I froze and kept listening, but nothing happened except Dad kept yelling. My instinctual thought was that Dad was getting a knife to kill Mum. Not this time. He was just making a sandwich. Over the years, I watched my father become a more aggressive, enraged and threatening man, rarely with any consequence for his crimes. He was proud with getting away with so much, and he was empowered, and that rendered the rest of the family powerless. Who do you call when you've called the police a number of times to intervene? How do you feel confident that you can leave for safety when you're easily found by him every time? As a child, I wished for no presents at Christmas, just peace. For someone to save us, they wouldn't. And for Dad to pass away in his sleep, he didn't. But as a child, I never imagined that I would be here in New York at the United Nations, speaking directly to the people with the power to change the future for families like ours. And the fact that Catherine and Vicky were even speaking in the UN was due to the media. And most importantly, to a committed journalist, Jennifer Feller from Australian Story, who stayed with that story over so many years. And not only did Jennifer document the shame, the fear, the courage of Catherine Smith and her children, but most importantly, she documented at the points where there was systemic failure, where there was a failure to keep women like Catherine safe. And she provided support and empathy when it was most needed. I also, when I travel, I speak of women like Andrea, who's an Aboriginal woman from Western Australia who died 3 years ago, aged 39 years, at the hands of her abusive estranged husband. The Human Rights Commission has just intervened in the coronial inquiry in Western Australia. And her murder followed a prolonged period of violence, multiple attempts by her to seek assistance, particularly housing and accommodation for herself and children. But she was turned away numerous times, and you'll know the stats better than me about the number of women who go to refuges to seek safe housing, but who are turned away each evening. And I think it's telling that Andrea was murdered while her estranged husband, Charles Pickett, was actually on parole following a conviction for threatening to kill her. And at the time of her murder, there was a violence restraining order in place. So yes, we have got better, but there's still so much to do. And it's stories like Catherine's, like Vicky's, like Andrea's, they provide a context for the prevalent rates of violence against women in this country. They tell us what the statistics can't, the stories that are often pushed to the periphery of our consciousness. They tell us about the reality of living with violence, with sexual assault, and the challenges that survivors face in ensuring their safety and that of their children. So who's going to tell these stories? Who's going to inform the community and inspire action to expose the human face and cost? And who is going to challenge and dismantle the myths, the stereotypes and attitudes that cause violence against women in the first place, that allow countless perpetrators to walk our streets? The simple answer is that the telling of these stories is a collective responsibility. It will take all of us. We need to involve victims and survivors, government, business, unions, service providers, and many, many others. But I think it is fair to say that journalists and the media in general have an even more fundamental role to play in telling the story of violence against women in this country. You have the power to make change happen and to take the lead in encouraging others to do the same. You may not be able to intervene to assist individual survivors and provide them with shelter in the way that the police might or that a violence refuge can, but you are agents of change. And I think that's why the EVAs is so important, is to celebrate those agents of change in the media, to thank you for educating the community and for exposing and challenging the myths, the stereotypes, the attitudes, and the unequal power relationships that cause and condone violence against women. See, the thing is, I travel around Australia, as I said, and internationally, but when I travel around Australia, I say to people, members of the community, I say, where do you think violence against women is a problem? And more often than not, they'll reel off a list of countries from overseas. They'll tell me Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Afghanistan. What they fail to recognise is that violence against women is endemic right here in Australia. And the failure to recognise the severity of a problem occurring in our own backyards was reinforced when Rashida Manjoo, the most wonderful woman who's a special rapporteur on violence against women in Australia, was down here in Australia, and I know she met with quite a number of you. But she told me at the end of her trip, she said, look, there's such a strong resistance in the community to acknowledging that Australia has a culture of violence against women. When I put my finger on, I could close my eyes and put my finger on a picture of the world map, and I know one thing about that country that I land on, and that is that violence against women will be a problem in that country. There is no country in the world that doesn't tolerate violence against women. So I think journalists have two such important functions to create systemic change. And one is, yes, it's educating the community about violence against women, the complexities, the myths. But the second thing, that through responsible reporting, is not to perpetuate and institutionalised harmful myths, stereotypes and attitudes about women. just to give you an example of that, Vic Health, they do some terrific research, and I love being part of that organisation. But they've found that more than half of the community believe that a woman could leave a violent relationship if she really wanted to. Or 8 in 10 people still question why women stay in violent relationships. These findings tell us that those who haven't experienced sexual assault, domestic or family violence, either personally or through their contacts, really struggle to understand what it means to be a victim or a survivor. They don't understand, for example, why some women are not able to seek refuge or safety from violent situations. They don't know about the limited number of refuges in rural areas, as Catherine found out. They don't know about the lack of shelters which will accept children, particularly when you've got more than 2 or 3 children, as Andrea, who had 7 children, found out. They don't know about women's fear of backlash and punishment if an abusive partner finds them. In other words, they don't know that it's not as simple as packing that bag and walking out. And I think the media's role in identifying these obstacles, better explaining the experiences of women, can play an important role in challenging some of those myths and stereotypes. Actually, Catherine Smith, when she spoke to the UN, she said, "I've been asked 1,000 times, why didn't you leave? Why did you keep going back? It's not a simple thing when someone's a control freak, a psychopath. He always found me any time I got away, and it made it far worse." And I actually say, when people ask me now, well, why doesn't she leave? I say, I think we're asking the wrong question. Why doesn't he stop abusing her is what we should be asking. And just secondly, journalists do bear the important responsibility not to perpetuate and institutionalise those myths. So we still see in today's media examples of dehumanising stories and images of women. Stories that convey the message so strongly that a woman's only or primary worth is how she looks. Advertisements that turn women's bodies into things to sell products to men. And it doesn't seem to matter what it is. It can be cars, deodorant, shoes and beer. Actually, the one that I'm looking at over the last couple of weeks, I think it takes the cake for this week in any event, and that is the livestock service Shear You, EWE. It depicts an ad featuring a woman in pink underwear being held down and shorn like a sheep. Derogatory language such as ditch the witch, and at times violent language, is used to describe the leader of our country, no less. And why in 2012 does it remain socially acceptable in Australia to use violent and derogatory imagery and language about women? Because I think the biggest problem about that is it normalises and trivialises violence and creates a climate in which it becomes much more widespread. So I'd like to finish now by recounting a final story which was told to me by the head of one of the Australia's largest women's organisations. And it is a story that gives me great hope about the potential to create change. It's the story of a woman called Ella. Now, Ella's in her 70s, and she'd been living an abusive relationship for around 45 years. Over Christmas, Ella's daughter and granddaughter came to stay with her. And while they were there, Ella's husband did what he often did, and that was to go down to the pub and come home drunk. And he walked into the kitchen, and like he so frequently did, he was violent towards Ella. Now, Ella's 40-year-old daughter, who'd grown up in a violent household, did what she always did, and that was to go and hide. But it was Ella's teenage granddaughter, who was watching from the next room and who'd just completed a respectful relationships program at home, she decided to do something different. And once the violence stopped, she went up to her grandmother and she said, "You know what, Gran, it doesn't have to be like this. Women in Australia have rights." And for the first time, someone, Ella's granddaughter, offered her a way out. And she arranged to take her grandmother to the domestic violence counselling service. The next day, she'd learnt that number at school. And she really changed the course of her family's life. And I think the heartening thing about that is that Ella, Ella's granddaughter, the least powerful member of that family, she spoke out, not in judgment, but in support, and in so doing, changed their futures. But just as everyone has a right to live life free from violence, so do we also have a responsibility to reduce violence and create peace. And my invitation to all of you tonight is, what can we do together? What actions can we take, big or small, that will move us to a world where dignity and respect lie at the core, a world in which violence has no place? And as I look around the room and I see the amazing collaboration that's happening here in Victoria, I'm absolutely convinced that with your talent, with your influence, with your help, we can do it. So thank you so much for asking me to come along this evening. As with any awards ceremony, there will be award winners announced this evening, and I can't wait to hear who. I congratulate you, and I thank you for using your considerable skill and talents to eliminate violence against women. But as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner, I cannot stress enough that it will take each and every one of us to create a more equal Australia. And so to everyone who nominated or who was nominated, who showed courage, originality and creativity, who cared about increasing Australia's awareness of violence against women, can I say such a big thank you? Because just like Ella's granddaughter, we can give dignity back and tell the truth kindly. My quest is to realise a peaceful world, one where all people can thrive irrespective of their gender. The EVAs take us one giant step forward towards that vision. Thank you very much.